My name is Rita Grendze. I am a local Fox Valley artist. I've lived in this area for just over 20 years. I consider myself an installation artist. My background is in fiber arts, and my practice is really strongly driven by the materials I use. I try to investigate those materials and really explore what their physical innate properties are, and in doing so, I learn about not only their physical properties, but usually I learn something about their history, about the narrative that goes along with those properties, how they were made, when they were made, what were the circumstances, what were the social, political things going on at the same time, and how I understand those. The process for me comes from the materials, but the materials are not the only source. There's always an underlying idea that usually comes through that initial investigation or through the process of even getting those materials. Who gave them to me? What's their history? What's my connection to them? This piece is brand new. It's called Collective Comfort. Pretty direct response to the trauma of the last several years for the world. Coming out of the pandemic, which had all kinds of effects on everyone, and working in schools, I can see how my third, fourth, and fifth graders, some of those kids have never had a normal school year. They don't know how to react with scissors. They don't know how to use pencils. And they're learning, but there is a definite disconnect with their social skills and with their ability to function in group settings. And also my own personal background, coming from an ethnic group, a country that was occupied for decades by the Soviet Union, and seeing what happened in Ukraine, I suddenly felt myself wanting to take everything I love, everyone I love, and give them a huge hug and just say, I know it's not okay today, but I believe that collectively we can make things better. So this piece is titled Collective Comfort because it's my way of extending a little love, a little grace to myself, for all the things that bother me when I get anxious, when I get angry, to go somewhere to find a space or a moment of touch. And physical touch is really important right now when we've had to be so distant. A moment where you can touch something or be in dialogue with something that is soft, that is generous, that isn't judging, and that might even make you a little uncomfortable, but in a good way. I think some of us, including myself, have become a little funny about even sometimes shaking hands with new people. It's psychological and it's very personal, but it's also very physical. So my work is physical, the process of making it is physical, the process of installing it is physical, and I wanted to make something that was just extremely tactile, extremely familiar, and not precious. So the work is touchable. We are encouraging people to hug when they need to. Just go ahead, hug the pieces gently. Nothing bad can happen to it. It's yarn. It's not even precious yarn. Throughout the pandemic, I used whatever materials I had. I didn't have much income because I was working in schools and all the schools were shut down. So I was using just materials I had and going through things that had been my mother's, and she has passed, so I had a lot of just her everyday stuff in my home. So I found, her big yarn basket. She was a big crocheter, and just started playing with the yarn and made some pom-poms, because when I was in fourth grade, I made pom-poms with eyes and sold them to my classmates. Found it really fun and actually really exciting to work with this very tactile material, because even though my background is in fiber, I hadn't worked with it in a long time. For me, the idea of them being, vertical speaks more of a figure, so it would feel more like something you could hug, or something you would feel comfortable, like kind of sidling up next to if you weren't comfortable hugging something in public, like just like you go up to a tree sometimes and lean on it. You can't really lean on these; they're hanging from the ceiling. But I like the idea of them being a vertical and more of that, a human body's kind of stature. The piece is called Lamella Series, and there are only 3 in the series. They're made out of grosgrain ribbon. Grosgrain ribbon is the one that's not the sleek, shiny, satiny one, but it's the one with the texture to it. And again, it started with someone gave me, they said, wow, I've got this whole roll like this of this ribbon. Can you do something with it? And I lived with it for probably too many years. And at one point when I moved studios from one place to the next, I found it again and started playing with what happens when you have a roll like this and you twist it or the center falls out. It gets those nice kind of striations. I thought, well, those remind me of the bottoms of mushrooms. And again, that took me back to when I used to visit Latvia. One of my aunts used to take us mushrooming. The bottom sides of the mushrooms are beautiful, and that's where I believe, if I'm not mistaken, all of the spores are everything that helps them propagate and renew. So the idea of this lamella, these folds that are very organic and kind of feminine, and in some ways they remind me of whipped cream. They're just this lusciousness out of simple ribbons that have been cut to the same size, and then a few stitches on the back and physically, that might be one of the most challenging piece I've ever made because it was really hard on the fingers. I mean, that grosgrain ribbon is strong stuff, so that's all I can say when you're trying to stitch it all together. So that's the story behind that. The floor piece is titled Untethered, Insistently, Carelessly, and the title comes from a Pablo Neruda poem, Forget About Me, which is one of my favorite poems. What I love about that poem is it talks about all the detritus we find on the seashore or near the water and how beautiful they are and how fleeting they are and how we think we want to collect these things and remember them. There's this nostalgia about them, and yet often we take them home and they do lose their meaning. It's just the language around that poem is very much the way that I think a lot about my family's history. So my parents are immigrants. They met in the States, but they both left Latvia when it was being occupied by the Soviet Union in the 1940s. They went through a lot. And I grew up hearing all of these stories my entire childhood and living in many ways in the nostalgic land of Latvia that had a very old language and old traditions, and everything seemed to be kind of colored in sepia and brown and earth tones, and there wasn't a lot of, I wouldn't say there wasn't joy, but everything was tampered down by this idea of the occupation. And Latvia fortunately regained freedom in 1991, which is wonderful. But my whole identity, everything I'd grown up learning and being part of, was suddenly twisted. So the idea of the immigrant for me became something else, and I found myself not nostalgic for people being immigrants or being refugees specifically, but nostalgic for that feeling of being tied to a purpose, the purpose of preserving a culture or being part of a culture that was now changing so rapidly that I wasn't always quite sure of my place in it. And I think, that was my truth. It might mean something else to other people. It's made up of 40-some clay bell-like objects that are also a little bit like figures, like hunched over figures with everything they own on their back, but they're all kind of tied together with some rope and some string. Some of it came to me from a friend, and I also found at a local surplus store there was some parachute rope, and they had that creosote smell, and it just seemed to me that these things belonged together, these bells and these tethers, and the idea of movement that maybe isn't the movement you want to be making. You're moving forward whether you want to or not. It's that group mentality, following the one in the front, and that trail that you leave behind you. It's no longer tethered to what you knew before, but it's kind of left to find its own way. Choristers Guild is a piece made up of Wurlitzer organ legs and choral sheet music. So a few years ago, I had made a large installation using books that had been damaged in a small flood in my own home, nothing major, but they couldn't go back on the shelf, so I salvaged what I could and used the books and the pages to make a large installation. And people learned that I was collecting books, so I, of course, at some point had a garage full of books. But afterwards, it was even a couple years later, someone offered me, I think it was 15 boxes of choral sheet music. Their choir no longer was going to use these. A lot of them were, holiday tunes. And I, having grown up in a minister's family with a lot of that music, I couldn't resist. Sheet music is just beautiful. So they gave me this music, and just like my books, a lot of them had been water damaged, were old and yellowed, so I salvaged what I could and started making them into these ball-like shapes. Around that same time, my friend whose father was a scavenger, had been a professor at Northern Illinois University. He had heard that the organ factory near where he lived in DeKalb was closing down, so he went there and scavenged a bunch of organ legs, gave them to my friend and said, "Your friend the artist needs to do something with these." And he was right. And I love the way that these came from two different places. They both spoke to me in different ways, and hopefully they'll speak to other people, but I love the idea of this leg, which is just a wooden leg now, but coming out of the top of it are these almost like flowers, like orchids, that are made of the sheet music. Our memories, they often fail us. They color the way I tell a story about, these pieces or my memories of growing up in an ethnic community. Someone who grew up with me at the same time and in the same space would remember it completely differently. And I might even be giving false information, but it's still my truth. So the things that are present are my talismans, or these are the objects that I have imbued with my narrative, with my nostalgia, if you will, my longing for that memory in a way, trying to give them, or trying to uncover the meaning that I think is already in them. and share that with others. And hopefully, even if they don't get my exact meaning, that little bit of nostalgia that's in there, that memory that I'm trying to share, will open a door and allow them to make their own narrative around it. It doesn't have to be what I said or what I saw with any of these pieces, but it could certainly, the idea of things being present means that they are of this day, and of course they have to change with the moment that they're in.